I'm Mary Costello from UKCES, and we've been working alongside Lakes for around about a year now, developing this series of masterclasses, which have been going really well, so it's good to see you all here today. So this afternoon's masterclass has been presented by Professor Francis Green from the Institute of Education, UCL Lakes Research Centre, about graduate jobs, how that market has changed and how it is continuing to change. There's been a lot of debate around this in recent years. So we'll hand over to Francis to give a presentation, and then there'll be a lot of time afterwards for discussion and questions. And we'd also like to get your feedback about how you found the session today, because we're going to be continuing to develop and promote more of these masterclasses as we go forward. We've got our date for June the 4th already in the diaries. That will be presented by Professor Hewitt Keep from Oxford University, looking at 16 to 19 vocational education training, what next. So that will be very interesting, but we'll send out details of that later. We'll hand over to Francis now and look forward to a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to everyone. Today is going to be on higher education and next time on vocational education. So yes, it's a very difficult subject, higher education. In the Economist magazine only 2 or 3 issues ago had this broad headline, "Everybody is going to university. What are we going to do about it?" And I guess you could say that today's talk is going to be looking around that topic. Now, there is a background, rather academic-y sort of a paper about this. There were a few hard copies left at the back. It looks as if they've gone already now, but you could obtain all the technical details if you feel you want to from our online website of Lakes. So it's a discussion paper. I can always remember it was number 50. So that's available. Indeed, I've got one more copy that I need for the moment, but I can hand out at the end of the talk for anyone who wants a hard copy, because personally I always prefer hard copies. And Golo, sitting in front, is my co-author on that paper. We wrote it together. So, without further ado, let's just go back to the background and say, where is this thing called tertiary education or graduate education? Well, it actually dates back a long time. Oxford claims to be the first in 1087 or something ridiculous. And for a long time, these 4 or 5 universities across Britain were the only few, but many centuries later, we saw the big expansion in the Victorian era, all the various big ones, the Manchesters, the Londons, and so on. And then nothing very much until the 1950s and the 1960s, and now we're into my lifetime, when many of these good universities were begun. They're now celebrating their 50th anniversary. Kent, where I used to work, had its 50th anniversary this year and last year. And then there was a short gap till the creation of the polys, which were in effect universities as well, but under a different name, and they eventually became universities. That happened in the 1970s. And then in the late 1990s, you see what I'm calling the new universities. Many other universities which were previously colleges of this or colleges of that, and they upped their game. A very large number of places opened, while at the same time all these other previous ones were increasing their numbers. And so what we get in terms of a picture is one of massive social transformation in our country. And this is the enrollment rate in tertiary education. You see that the real period of change, gradual change in the 1970s and 1980s, but right at the end of the 1980s, that's when the big takeoff took place, up until about the middle of the 1990s. For men, it seems to be pretty stationary since then, but women still edging upwards. These are big numbers, these switching from around 20% to around 60%. It's a massive change in the way we live in the modern era, certainly in my lifetime. And that then brings us to the labour force itself. As you would expect, if you keep filling up the bucket with more and more people with higher education, or tertiary education as we call it, gradually the stock of the labour force gets more and more educated, more and more proportions in the labour force with tertiary education. We see women exceeding men, as we know that women tend to get more educated than men in the modern era. But basically this is a pretty fast expansion rate from the 1990s through to the present. If you want a round figure number, it's roughly 4% per year. And anyone who knows simple maths says that 4% a year is a pretty fast rate. You don't need more than a decade or two before you get a big social transformation. If we could have a growth rate of 4%, we'd be extremely pleased, for example, an economic growth rate. So that's pretty large. So, how do we understand this effect? Now, I'm an economist and I'm tasked talking about the economic effects of this, and that's basically what today is going to be about the relationship to the labour market. But I will make a remark now, and probably again later. Universities, tertiary education is not just about the labour market. People learn all sorts of other life skills, and whatever I say is not meant to denigrate those other aspects of the importance of education in social life generally. But if we want to understand the economics of it all, we have actually three frameworks. We have the pure neoclassical economists framework of human capital, which essentially always looks to the question, are these investments good investments? And they look to estimate the returns to higher education. And there are a number of studies, I've just quoted one up there, the references are all in the discussion paper, which show that despite this enormous increase in highly educated labour coming onto the labour market, there seem to be more or less maintained returns of higher education. That is to say that, if you like, the price, despite the enormous increase in quantity, the price stayed the same. Might even gone up a little bit in some of the studies, which suggested to economists that there must have been an enormous increase in demand for these high-level skills as well. Nonetheless, the thing's ongoing. It's not like just a study is done and that's finished. This thing's changing all the time, and increasingly over the last 5 years or more, really, 5-10 years, there's been some evidence of differentiation along a number of cracks, if you like, by subject, by type of university. Those are two of them, and by other categories as well. In other words, for some people going to university, it seems to be a very good payoff, and others maybe not so good. And the difference between the two, there is some evidence, may be increasing, if you like, suggesting that, okay, it's still on average maybe a good thing, or has been a good beneficial thing to go to university, but maybe it's become more risky, because if you get the lower returns, it's not so good. That's one whole framework. There's lots of studies in that area. Some studies, at least, in that area. Then there's another framework which is kind of a cross between sociologists and heterodox economists, by which I mean people who don't sort of follow a strictly neoclassical line on this, which very much want to look at the demand for skills more directly. And they're focused on this concept called over-education, which essentially means you've got qualification level higher than what's required for the job. People, myself included, have argued that over-education, or sometimes called over-qualification, is a useful concept for understanding the way labour markets are changing. An extreme version of this became very popular, or was kind of quite notorious a couple of years ago, which is Philip Brown and colleagues' book. Actually, it's 2011. I got the date wrong there. which essentially, it was called the Global Auction. And their book stressed that with the massive worldwide expansion of graduates, what we were seeing is, on the one hand, a de-skilling of the bog standard graduate. He coined this phrase, digital tailorism, the idea that graduates are doing more and more routine, more and more ordinary, less challenging jobs, and couldn't expect the rewards and the challenging jobs that their predecessors had had in earlier generations, except for a talented few who went to the elite universities around the world. And this is where the word global came in, that if you went to the top universities in any of a number of countries, then you could expect to get a potential entrance into one of these very, very high-paying jobs. So it was kind of linked to the increasing inequality which we have in the world. So that's another whole literature which is surrounding that. And then the other literature I would point you to is the literature about the changing structure of the labour market, which has been dominated, I would say, for the last 10 years by the argument that there is not only what we call a skill-biased technological change, that technology driving an ever-increasing demand for skill, but a polarisation which is arising because those middle-level jobs have been more easily replaced by computers over the last 2 decades. In other words, there are more routine jobs in the middle, sort of backroom jobs in banks and companies, which have now, instead of requiring large swathes of middle-educated labour, have now been replaced by computers. So that's the whole literature, which also obviously affects the demand for graduate labour. Particularly, you might think that if you fail to get one of these, quotes, graduate jobs, which I'm going to talk about very soon, and you slip into that middle and all those middle jobs are disappearing, then maybe the costs of slipping down are even greater. So there are 3 literatures which are worth taking note of. Okay, so that's all by way of background. This is what I really then wanted to talk about. To what extent, in the modern era, is this number of graduate jobs keeping up with that fantastic rising supply of graduates? It's a simple but also difficult question to address. And it requires addressing first the question, what is a graduate job? So that's what I want to talk about for the first half. What's a graduate job? I'm going to mention what are the existing indicators, and then I'm going to present a method that we've devised, myself we've devised, for generating a new statistical indicator. And then we're going to use this new indicator to look at some recent changes in the British labour market over the last decade or so. So that's the plan. So I'm going to first start with a picture of a number of different, almost randomly drawn jobs, which I entertained myself with Google at 8 o'clock this morning doing. And here's your quiz for the morning. There's 9 jobs up there. How many of them are graduate jobs? I'll give you the answer before the end. Solicitor, air traffic controller, farm manager, senior police officer, lab technician, doctor, police constable, civil servant, draftsperson. Okay. How many of them are, out of the 9, a graduate job? Moving on. That's the idea, is to get to give you the answer, and we'll show you how we arrived at that answer. So the question is first, what is this thing called a graduate job? I mean, there are some people, some of my purist economist friends, who might say, well, there's no such thing, it's a kind of fake concept. But the truth of the matter is that lots of people talk about the graduate job. HR people, careers officers, newspapers, all have this concept of a job which is suitable for graduates to do. So we wanted to think, well, what is that? And it seems to me that it has to be a skills-based concept. That is to say, this is the definition we came up with, a substantial part of the skills used in the job are normally acquired in the course of that higher education. But also it's the things which go around it, and also its aftermath. That word aftermath is referring to the fact that often in a lot of graduate jobs you don't actually get the skills when you're in the university, but you derive the learning skills so that you can pick them up when you do start working. So that's going to be the central concept, which we'll come back to. I want to say a few things about it before we proceed. Of course, not all the skills are going to be acquired just in the lecture room or in the class, or even in your study when you're learning at home with your handouts and your textbooks itself. A lot of it, of course, is acquired through there, but some of it's required through the HE experience itself. Perhaps I'm sufficiently old-fashioned to think that actually discussions with your mates, learning about things through discussions within the context of the university is part of it. Secondly, we shouldn't think of the skills in a very narrow way. We must think of it in a broad way, and particularly in graduate skills, we're going to have a mix of subject-specific knowledge and more generic skills, analytical thinking, ability to work in teams, and so on and so forth, all of which I would claim, and many others would claim, are acquired in the course of a university or a tertiary education. But of course, skills are also acquired at other sites, family, or later on at work, independently of HE. We're not denying that. So it's not like everything you get is from the university. And of course, something I said at the beginning, not all the skills you get at university for work. Lots of it, people go to university because they want to study English literature or something like that, and good for them. They don't necessarily need to apply it to work in order to justify it, as far as I'm concerned. So, if we want an indicator, if we want to analyse how the graduate labour market is performing, we want an indicator which says this job's a graduate job, that's not a graduate job. And traditionally, people have worked with the idea that professional jobs are graduate jobs and most managerial, at least decent managerial jobs. So that's a kind of traditional concept. We would argue that that's now become outdated, just to limit it to that. It's a kind of nostalgic version of what a graduate job is. And it would seem to me absurd if everybody starting out on tertiary education thinks they're necessarily going to get a good managerial or a good or a professional job, and I don't believe they do. So we have to think beyond just the traditional, and that's really the purpose of the exercise. The second attempt at doing it, you see somewhere, is basically the idea, well, jobs are graduate jobs, or what graduates do. It's kind of tautological almost, isn't it? And indeed it is used tautologically, sometimes even in seemingly sophisticated analyses. You find forecasts of the future, but basically they're just forecasts of the future supply, nothing to do with demand. Peter Elias and Kate Purcell actually used that approach, but in rather a sophisticated way, I have to say, by looking at the different vintages of graduates in the different jobs. But they've since moved on, and I'll come back to them in a minute. A third approach that some people use is this wage-based approach. They say jobs, that is to say occupations that have a high wage return to college education, are graduate jobs. But there are many problems with that, and very, very difficult to generalise that from one time to another, from one place to another. Much the best of the existing indicators are ones which use some kind of expert judgment over the skills used in jobs. And Peter Elias and Kate Purcell are the best people on that. They produced an index a couple of years ago. What they did was they, well, I think I've got a slide on that. They went through the job titles which you can find in the labour force survey, and essentially conducted this forensic classification of jobs. And what they did was they had the notion that there were three kinds of skills used in graduate jobs. There were specialist skills, orchestration skills, and communication skills. And they lined up all the job titles and then went through each of them in turn that people had filled in for the labour force survey and made a judgment, scored them out of 9, and anything averaging above a certain threshold they then called a graduate job. So they arrived at it through a kind of forensic expert investigation of these titles. It was very good because it was based on skills usage. It wasn't saying graduate jobs or what graduates do. It just, was based on what was needed to do the job. But of course, against that, it is a pretty costly exercise to go through individual job titles, like 1,500 of them, and you can't necessarily change them very quickly. It's very rigid. You can't necessarily apply it to other classifications, and it's not easily replicable. It's not clear how exactly they arrived at individual decisions. So this is what we've done. We wanted to move beyond that and derive an index which was statistically based. And so let me move quickly because I know there's time limitations. We wanted an index which would classify jobs based on the skills level requirements and the skills specialisation. We wanted to link it to the standard occupational classification. The standard occupational classification has 4 hierarchical levels, so it's the 4-digit level that we're interested in here. We want, which is called the unit group, and our aim was to classify each of these 369 unit groups as to whether they were graduate jobs or non-graduate jobs. That's essentially what we were trying to do. And to do this, obviously, we need data on the skills usage in jobs, because that's the basic concept. The data is based on the skills, British skills surveys. This is a sort of generic slide I often use, but it's really the last 4 which we focus on here, from 1997 onwards through to 2012. We use the data from all these people, which systematically asked people in hour-long or more than hour-long interviews the various activities and tasks they had to perform in their jobs and the skills used to do them. Some of you may be familiar with those surveys from elsewhere. I can talk more about it later, but it's probably best if I move on to get to the substance of it. From this, we could derive various skills indices, whether a degree was deemed required for the job by the individual. We could look in similar jobs, that's at the same level of the major occupational hierarchy. Then we had these generic skills, literacy skills, professional communication skills. Some of these may seem a bit mystical to you, but they've all got very concrete questions and items in the survey. For example, professional communication is what I'm trying to do now. It's like making a speech or presentation. So people are asked how important making speeches and presentations is for their job. There's a lot of variation between jobs. Managerial responsibility, self-planning, specialist knowledge, and so on and so forth. A number of generic skills, and we took the top part of those skills. The presumption is, not all, but on average, generally, graduate jobs, high-level skilled jobs, have got jobs which are going to use some or all of these at a higher level. Similarly, with computer use, complex or advanced computer use, and jobs which would require at least 2 years training for the type of work. So all those numbers are obtained from the survey. Don't dwell too long on this particular slide. These are just the basic statistic. For example, 27% of jobs are jobs which require high-level literacy skills, according to the way we defined it. Whereas, say, 25% have supervisor responsibilities, and so on and so forth. It gives you just the basic proportions of the workforce, proportions of the jobs which require these high-level skills. And the key thing now is to explain the method, the steps we took to arrive from those skill requirement things to getting to the job. So, the first thing we do is to calculate the effect of each of those skill demand variables on the propensity for a job to require a level 4 qualification. Now, level 4 qualification is basically tertiary education. It's quite a broad definition of graduate. It's including obviously all university degrees and postgrads, but also foundation degrees, 2-year HNDs and so on and so forth. So it's tertiary education. We can do another version which is more restricted to university level degrees, but it includes those 2-year courses as well, and also professional qualifications such as nurses and so on and so forth. And if anyone is interested in the technical side of it, we use a linear probability model. But essentially what we're trying to do is to estimate the probability that a person will be in a graduate job given the observed skill requirements of the job. Okay? So that's the first step, estimating that probability for each one given the skill requirements that person has. Then step 2 is for each unit group, because we know what occupation they're doing, we aggregate the predicted score for that particular group. And then step 3 is we run what's called a cluster analysis, which is essentially a statistical procedure for putting things into boxes. And we ran a pretty simple statistical analysis which says put them into 2 boxes, graduates and non-graduate jobs, graduate jobs and non-graduate jobs, on the basis of the score which represents the skill requirements of the job. Okay? So, that meant that we had, of all the various unit groups, remember I told you there were 300 and something, 136 of them went into the graduate box and 217 of them went into the non-graduate box. The skills index in the graduate box is 0.5, in the other one it's 0.07. So it seemed to be pretty nicely discriminating between the skills requirements of the graduate jobs and the non-graduate jobs. And now the question arises, well, how does it work? How does it look using these 3 steps? Well, the threshold between graduate jobs and non-graduate jobs came out. This is something that comes out of the statistical analysis. It's very open and transparent, and anybody could do the same thing. Came out to be 0.274, which is, if you like, the dividing line between jobs which we're now going to call graduate jobs and jobs we can call non-graduate jobs. Now these things here, 1, 2, 3 to 9, are the major occupational categories. So these are managers, professionals, associate professionals, and so on down to the elementary occupations. So you can see where the threshold is. It's nicely giving you a plausible picture here. It's saying that pretty well most of the managerial jobs are graduate jobs. All of the professional jobs, the traditional notion of graduate job, they're all graduate jobs, few. It would be sad if something wrong if we couldn't get that. But we also find a good number of these associate professional, associate technical jobs come out as graduate jobs. Not all of them, because this is what's this, a 75% quartile range. So that, there are a number of jobs way down here below the threshold. So first of all, it looks kind of plausible that because all the other ones they're way below the threshold, and none of them come out as graduate jobs. So it looks kind of plausible. Now I'm going to give the answer to these ones that come out. Well, the answer is that all but one of them come out as graduate jobs in this particular. Going back to the same slide, they all come out above that threshold. These, I mean, obviously doctor and solicitor, you'd expect them to, but draftsperson, lab technician, air traffic controllers, which are all in the category 3, they're all above the threshold in terms of their skills requirements. I have to say that not all that our jobs can be very securely and confidently put above or below the line. It's not a perfect thing. So we say in the paper, by the way, there's a complete list of all 370 odd occupations at the back of the paper, so you can look at the list. Well, what it seems to be doing, in other words, this process is nicely discriminating in a way between jobs which are graduate jobs and not graduate jobs. And it goes beyond the traditional one of saying, well, if I want to become a graduate so I can be a doctor or a solicitor. So, I've got a couple of slides here of typical occupations. These are non-graduate occupations in the level 3, for example. Police officers below sergeant level and so on. So there are a number of them that came out. They weren't using, these occupations were not using skills at a high enough level to be classified as a graduate job. Now, the stage I'm going to skip over is the validation stage, but just to say what we did was to check that our indicator showed nice correlations with wages, things like job satisfaction and so on. And in every case, we found our indicator performed better than or as well as the other indicators. So we were quite happy that our indicator was doing quite a good discriminatory job there. So now I want to spend 5 minutes or so just giving you a picture of the changing graduate labour market using our brand indicator. This is a period which, moving up to the present day, or present last 7 years, compared to the slides I had right at the beginning, we see the continuing ongoing rapid expansion of higher education, continuing changing skills demand, but also, of course, the Great Recession. So how is the graduate labour market being resolved? The answer is that actually it's not as dire as sometimes has been painted over recent years. I'm trying to sum up the next few slides. But let's just take the bottom line here for the total, rather than looking at men and women separately, though we can come back to that. If you take the percentage employed in the labour force who are graduates, that's gone from 30% to 41%, or 31 to 41%, about 10 points difference over this period, this 97 to 2001, these averages from the end of the 2000s, the end of the 90s, about 10 percentage points. But in terms of the graduate jobs, it's gone from 32% to 40%. It's actually still increased there, hasn't it? There's been quite a substantial increase in the number of graduate jobs over that period.
If there's a question about that, is that graduates employed in graduate jobs, or could that be non-graduates employed in graduate jobs?
Could be, yeah.
Could be either.
Could be either, and I'll get into that, the matching process in a moment. Yeah, but yeah, it's a good question. But still looking just at the aggregate, this picture gives the last 7 years, from 2007 till the third quarter of 2014. And I think this is quite an interesting one. It gives you, the bars are the supply of graduate labour, and these are the demands, these are the proportions of graduate jobs. We can see a pattern here that the supply seems to be increasing more than the demand over this period of about 7 years. Perhaps that's what you might expect, given the very rapid expansion of the graduate labour force. But I will say two things. First of all, this diagram doesn't account for the fact that some of these jobs, we're calling graduate jobs, may have been changing. In other words, you could have jobs which are non-graduate, skills increasing it, then they become classifiable as a graduate job. But for this diagram, we had to assume that didn't happen over a relatively short period. Second is this awkward little break in the middle. That's what happens when they change the occupational classification system in 2010. I don't think it actually takes away from the propriety of this particular diagram if we forget about that break. So yes, that doesn't seem so good. It looks like, especially if you went a long time into the future, think, oh my God, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. But look at this diagram here. This is the trend over the same period, the graduate over qualification. That is to say, people, and this is coming to this gentleman's question here. These are people who are graduates. They've got their tertiary level qualification, but they're not in a graduate job. Okay, and the difference between these two diagrams is this is for recent graduates, and this is for more experienced graduates after, I think, five years. After 5 years,
At least 3.
I forget exactly how, but these are for. So there is a sort of 10 or 15 percentage point difference between there and there. But the main thing to take away from this is, actually, it doesn't seem to have been increasing so much. It's been wobbling up and down a bit. This one's gone maybe up a little bit, but you don't see an obvious upward trend over this 7-year period, which seems to contrast with the previous slide, which showed the aggregate supply of graduate skills going up at a steadily rate faster than the aggregate proportion of graduate jobs. What's going on? What's going on? The answer is there's been a decrease in the number of non-graduates doing graduate jobs, what we call underqualification. So back in 2007, you could say that there were something like 35% of the workforce was non-graduate doing a graduate job. How did they do that? Well, of course, they'd acquired their skills in other ways. They hadn't gone to university. They got it through work experience, nous, whatever. It's always possible, has been for a long time, particularly for older workers, to acquire, to move up into graduate jobs, even though they haven't got the qualification. And there were 35% of them back in 2007. There were only 27% of them last year. So that's going down. So what seems to be happening is that those people retire or somehow move on, those jobs are being filled by graduates. And that's why graduates, the fortunes of graduates over this recent period has not been so bad as you might expect from this diagram there. That one looks pretty bad. This one looks okay, in a sense that it's not getting any worse. Okay. So maybe I've got time for one more slide of findings here before I stop and ask for questions. You might want to think, well, how much does it matter whether or not you're on a graduate job? Because obviously it does matter if you're a graduate. So we computed the wage premium for being in a graduate job for graduates. So what we have here is the wage premium for matched graduates relative to matched non-graduates. That is to say, we're comparing, other things equal, a graduate in a graduate job with a non-graduate in a non-graduate job, and see how that changed over time. And the answer is that over this period of about a decade or so, from the end of the 90s to the end of the 2000s, that increased. So the matched graduate, the graduate in the graduate job, relative to the non-graduate in the non-graduate job, was getting better a little bit. At least for men. For women, it stayed the same. It's always been a bit higher. But, and here's the point, the really key point, the gap between the matched and mismatched graduates, that is to say the graduate in a graduate job compared to the graduate in a non-graduate job, that has been increasing over time. From 47% to 67%. So that's a big difference in weight. So if you set out, say today, and expected the same thing, you set out today, like, I'll become a graduate, I'll invest in, so I'll become a graduate, well, you better get a graduate job after that, because if you don't, you get lumbered in a non-graduate job, then the penalty seems to be getting worse. And this is part of the story about the dispersion of the returns to graduate education, which I mentioned in the beginning in the literature. We've seen it in previous studies, we're seeing it in this simple little use of the indicator here. So the basic conclusion is there's an ongoing increase in the demand for graduate skills, but there is a rising dispersion of those returns. If you want to know how Britain compares with other countries, this is an ongoing project that Golo and I are working on. It will be also part of the new Centre for Higher Education, for the Global Studies for Higher Education, which will be starting out in October, based at the Institute of Education, but also involving the Sheffield University and some foreign universities. And so there's going to be a major programme on higher education research, all aspects of it, not just economics. But a little sort of advanced look at that, as Golo and I have been studying this same indicator using the international data from the OECD, the PIAC data, on skills use. And the short answer to this question, you may be interested, is that Britain, or England rather, and Northern Ireland, because they're the ones that took part, are broadly in the middle of the spectrum in terms of the usage of graduate labour, much higher than highly productive Germany and France, interestingly, and Japan, but lower than the leading ones, which are Netherlands, Norway and Belgium. And you can maybe get some discussion of why you think that's so.
I'm kind of interested in the impact on the non-graduates, actually,
Yeah.
because it looks like they're the ones that are losing out on opportunities, you know. And I think although the way that you look at graduate jobs is, you know, you need these skills and those skills, and that's, you know, that's good. But in a sense, there's a bit of me that wonders if there are certain skills where you really do need a degree, and others where it's just used as a sifting mechanism. And the extent to which that helps performance or doesn't help performance in organisations. Because there's such a high cost now to go to university, isn't there, that you sort of, in a sense, and not just in terms of financial outcomes, but in terms of what happens to the non-graduate labour force, that what are you really adding by having graduates going into those jobs as opposed to non-graduates, if you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean. But there's a micro and macro dimension to your question there, that some things might have a good micro return, but maybe from the aggregate perspective, for the country as a whole, not so. So, I think if any teenager comes to me and asks me whether it's worth going to university, I still say definitely, because even if the returns are maybe getting lower, even if the pay of a starting graduate is getting lower, pay of the starting non-graduate is even lower. So the benefit of it is still there. From the micro perspective, some of it may be to do with the signalling, sifting mechanism that you talked about. We do have things in there which I didn't have time to talk about to try and sift out that sifting, because people are asked, for example, whether they really need the qualification they told us about in order to do the job competently. So if somebody was really listening, they would be required to get a degree, but they were doing like a bar working job. That's an extreme. We should be able to sift that out with the questions, but we probably don't do it perfectly. Yeah, so, but it still could be the case at a macro level. instinct would apply.
I mean, in a sense, because I'm doing lots of work on gender inequality, it reminds me of some of the issues there, that we are systemically rewarding certain attributes and not other attributes. And that's kind of interesting, has interesting implications. I think not just for the economy, but for individuals as well.
Yes.
I'm interested in how your indicator maps to the Elias and Purcell indicator that's used for the destination of leavers from higher education classification. Did you see a difference? And obviously, as you know, the Delhi classification really informed league tables and that kind of thing. If your indicator was used, do you think it would have a different impact?
We haven't looked at the Delhi classification. Compared with Peter Elias's classification, ours is a bit broader by about 5 percentage points or so. So we've done quite a lot to compare the validity of the two indicators by looking at just say which would give the best explanation of wages, for example, or job satisfaction. So we're pleased to say we think ours works better, and we checked it with different data sets. One of the advantages of our indicators, you can apply it to any data set where the occupation is classified. Obviously that's true of Peter's as well. What you might want to think of the two indicators as complementary. His is based on this expert forensic looking. Ours is based on statistical surveys and statistical methods. We think ours is more transparent because, to be honest, we don't actually know how they decided one particular job is a graduate or non-graduate, whereas we do. You could take the data away and do it yourself.
Well, absolutely. Looking at those list of jobs, we estimated that 5 or 6 were under the Elias and Purcell classification. So
We're not.
Were graduate jobs.
Were
yeah,
graduate.
5 or 6, we thought. If you were, that's so obviously the classification that we're familiar with.
Yeah. Well, ours. I mean, the differences are mainly going to be in the level 3, in the major group 3 occupations, these associate professionals. And we think ours does, because we've even looked within that what we call the risk zone to see how good ours are discriminating over pay and other issues. And again, we do at least as well or better than theirs. So, and we think that the advantage of ours is that it can easily be updated, applied to other countries and so on.
So what's the future for your indicator then? Are you going to be lobbying for it to be taken forward instead of Elias and Purcell? I mean, where are you going to go with your indicator?
Well, that's a really good question. We're making presentations like this. We hope that I have made a presentation to people in BIS a few months ago. It needs more and more. We need to make some more impact with it. I mean, neither indicators in the sense official. They're just indices out there. We think ours is of some value. I think I'm not wishing to put Peter Elias's and Kate Purcell's indicator down. We think ours is broader. The outcome is broader. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But it actually does predict better what people's wages are, what people's job satisfaction is. So that would be our argument in favour of it, or one of the arguments. But our method we can simply apply, as we have done now, to lots of different countries. And we can apply it, as long as we can continue doing these skills surveys, we'll be able to pick up how the skills change over time. I'm not sure how Peter and Kate would do it again in 2018, say. Would they go back and look at job titles again and do this mental scoring again and see how jobs have changed? Because I mean, some jobs will have become upskilled by then, some may have been downskilled by then with the progress of various forms of IT. So expert judgments have their place, but
I think one thing that is interesting with your measure is that you're looking internationally as well, because now that HESA require universities to collect data on international students, and at the moment that's not publicly, it's not put out publicly, it's not in league tables and so on, but you can see a time when that could change. And it's quite difficult to, at the moment, to look at how international jobs are classified compared to UK-based jobs. So actually the fact that you're doing that is actually a big plus point, I would say.
Thank you. I think, to be honest with ourselves, we haven't really thought through the implications for the university league tables, which is what you're coming from. So maybe this is something that we need to spend some time on, because if you ask me now, I don't know how these employability indices are used in international league tables. And indeed, the centre, which Golo and I could contribute to this new centre, and that's the advantage of having a research centre actually, because I should be able to pick up that knowledge more easily by my colleagues who work with these university league tables all the time. So I think in a couple of years' time I wouldn't have made that mistake. But yeah, it's very, very useful to know that, so that I mean, we need to look inside those indices and see how they, because I didn't realise that they were using the graduate jobs indicators. They're using the Elias and Purcell one, are they? So that's what you compare across universities within Britain, according to the delivery of Elias and Purcell graduate jobs.
And that's why, if you look at certain job titles, certainly as in the careers world, we question it and go that in our minds it is a graduate level job, but according to the Elias and Purcell classification, it's not.
Right.
Which is
okay. So
which is, as you say, an large matter of fact, they cannot keep up with what's actually changing.
So who are the people we should be talking to? You?
Well, actually, I'm the director of careers at UCL, so we're from the same. So obviously, we're quite new in the same and the careers group, University of London.
We take about 15% of the UK's graduate data, so there's a lot of information about it. Which means we classify about 15% of them, which is quite a lot of classifying for all graduates.
Right. And then you feed that into these various
Different institutions
that build up the. Can we meet? Good. Excellent.
Any more questions? We've got time.
I'm actually from a labour market company, and we look at labour market information and look at the comparison between training and jobs. For skills, we actually break occupations down, so we use the SOC codes, the 4-digit SOC codes, and we break down the occupations using ONET from America. So that we look at skills and competencies within each of the 370 occupations. In terms of classifying graduate jobs, what we look at is some typical entry qualifications. So we just kind of list as is it level 2, level 3, level 4, 5, 6. So we don't use the term graduate level, we use typical education level, but we'd be really interested in sort of talking to you about your classification as well. Because to be able to use that to map it would be fascinating. We work with colleges and universities, and they actually use our database to actually go in and see what's happening to the labour market now, but also forecasting into the future, looking at the sort of skills needs that are required in the local region, and then mapping that back to their curriculum and checking there's a match, because if there's no match there, if you're not generating the right workforce, then.
Sorry, I forgot which institution.
MZ, no, it's a company called MZ EMSI. I'll give you my card.
And I think Dr.
Yeah. Is the picture potentially blurred by high levels of investment in work-based high-level vocational qualifications? So people who could be defined as underqualified are actually qualified through an occupational route at a high level, but not graduates.
Well, that's an important part of the story, the fact that graduate skills can be substituted at the margin by other kinds of qualification skills. And that I think is partly what's behind the differences between countries. But in terms of what we're doing here, it's basically based on the skills requirements of the jobs, because we ask people in these interviews, we got them there for an hour and they're telling us lots of details about what they do in their jobs. So it's based on that, on what they actually do, and then they ask this question about what qualification do they require in order to do the job competently. So I think it's accurate from that point of view, but behind it all, in theory terms, there's always that possibility of substitution of graduate skills from good quality vocations.
Yeah.
And how does the higher apprenticeship sit in that framework? You were supposed to alluding to higher apprenticeship, they would be work-based, but they might do a HND or HNC as part of that apprenticeship.
They will be level 4, and so if they answer the question correctly, then they will be counted. Yeah, they will be counted. Yeah, there's not many of them.
With graduates, and I'm wondering what that mismatch
Yeah.
between businesses seeing them as, you know, high-level technician type jobs, especially in manufacturing and engineering, but not necessarily seen them as graduates or graduate jobs.
Well, that's maybe because they have an old-fashioned concept of a graduate job. That's why we hope we bring them into the modern day. I just don't think it.
Yeah.
There are still lots of people around who have this notion of posh job, which is essentially the old-fashioned professional job, isn't it? And it's just unrealistic to stick to that alone. So, yeah, higher-level apprenticeships should come into this equation. I think they should be properly counted. Not many of them at the moment.
No.